One of the things that any application has to be able to do is make decisions. Decisions are inescapable. They are an important part of pretty much any non-trivial program that you're ever going to make. Decisions are made when your program flow is chugging along nicely and suddenly you come to a situation where you have to make a decision. And the results of the decision are either true or they're false. And this is, of course, built in classical programming using the if statement. The if statement takes a Boolean condition, and if that condition is true, then the code that is inside the if statement is executed. Now, of course, there's a case for when the condition is not met, and that is the else case. If the condition is not met, and you have an else case on your if statement, because they are, after all, optional, then the code for the condition where the condition is not met is run instead. In C#, you can also have the else if statement. So we could replace that else with else if, another condition. And in fact, we can chain a bunch of these together to make a whole bunch of if, else if, else if, else if, and so on. And if you want, you can have a trailing else condition to handle everything else. So let's jump over to the code and see this in action. Here in the code, I've opened up my conditional code example file, and I've got my program.cs code open. I've also got the example snippets file open right here. And I'm going to scroll down to the conditional statements section because these are the statements that we're going to be using. So back over here in the code, let's put together an if statement and see how it works. So I'm going to copy these lines right here, my variable declaration along with the if statement. I'll copy, and we'll just paste that in. And you can see here that we have a variable named the val, which is initialized to be 50. And then we have an if statement, which tests the condition to see if the val is equal to 50, then run some code. Notice that there's two equal signs in here. If I just tried to put one equal sign in here, I would get an error. You can see the little red squiggle shows up and it says, hey, you can't do a conversion. And it's not important what that error means. The point is that you can't do that. So to test for equality, it's two equal signs. One equal sign does assignment, two equal signs tests for equality. So if the val is equal to 50, then we'll write out this data. It says first var is 50. And actually, let me change that because it's misspelled. There we go. The val is 50. So we'll save this and we'll run it. I'll use F5 to do that. And you can see that the val is 50 is being written out. So let's go back to the code and change the value. Let's make it 51. And we'll save and run it again. And you can see this time nothing's being written out because the condition is not being met. Let's go back to the code. Let's change this back to 50. The other thing I want to point out on the if statement is you'll notice that I'm using these curly braces to contain the code that's being executed in the case of the if condition. If all you have is one line of code for your if condition, you actually technically leave these braces out, and that will work just fine. However, for the sake of readability and because if statements are very rarely limited to one line, I always use the braces. I always put them in there. It's a good idea to do so. It helps readability of code. It helps keep your statements together. So my suggestion is to always use the curly braces, even if you only have one line. Let's go back to the snippets. And let's bring a couple of other lines in here now. We're going to try the else if condition this time. So I'll copy this. And we'll paste it in below the if. So now we have a condition that says if the val is 50, then write out this statement. Otherwise, else if it's 51, write out something else. And once again, I'll just change that. Okay, so let's run this. Okay, so you can see that the first condition is being met. Now let's change it to 51. Save and run using F5. And you can see that this time the else if condition ran because the value was 51 instead of 50. So this time this condition was executed instead. One more test to try. Let's go back and copy this code over. And I'll copy this and paste it at the bottom of my else. And in this case, this code is going to run when none of the conditions are met. So we have if the val is 50, else if the val is 51, and then the last else condition catches everything else. So let's just change this to, I don't know, something like 75. We'll save and we'll hit F5. And you can see that in this case, the val is something else is being written out because the last else condition is triggering because the value was not equal to 50 or not equal to 51. So none of these if conditions right here fired. You can have more than one condition in the if statement. So for example, if I wanted to have this if condition execute if the val was equal to 50 or something else, I would simply put this one in parentheses. And then I would use the OR operator, which is the 2 vertical bars. And we'll learn about this a little bit later, but just bear with me for now. So if the val is 50 or the val is equal to 49, then we can write out the val is 50 or 49. And we'll save. And now this if condition will execute if the val is equal to one of those two numbers. So we'll change it to 49. Hit F5, and you can see that the first if condition is now being set. So that code is executing. Let's go back. If we wanted to change it to and instead of or, we would just use 2 ampersands. Again, we'll learn about that in a little bit, but just for sake of example, I want to show you how this works. Now in this case, the val is something else. Why? Because here the val is 49, but for this entire condition right here to be true, both of those statements have to be true. The val has to be 49 and the val has to be 50. And since that's clearly impossible, that first statement is not going to execute. So you can see here that we're using if statements to create tests for conditions in our code. And we can chain a whole bunch of these things together using if, and else. But if you find yourself running into a situation where you have a lot of different conditions to test for, using a whole bunch of ifs and else ifs gets really hard to read and really hard to manage. And there's a structure for doing that, which we'll take a look at in a little bit.